The security guard didn't know the man in the dusty field jacket had designed the building he was protecting. He didn't know that the 9-year-old girl holding the man's hand had been carried through these doors as an infant, or that the largest painting in the main gallery had been made by the girl's mother in the last months of her life. He didn't know any of that. He saw a tired-looking man in worn work clothes and a child with paint on her sneakers, and he held up one hand. "Events private tonight, sir. Ticketed guests only." Brendan Hollis stopped. He looked at the guard's hand, then at the entrance to the crestwood behind him, the brushed steel lettering above the door, the warm amber glow spilling out through the tall glass panels, the well-dressed crowd moving easily inside like water finding its level. He had stood in this exact spot 100 times. He had approved the lighting. He had chosen the door handles. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his invitation. The guard looked at it. "Hold on. Someone will be right with you." Someone turned out to be Portia Thorne. She came through the doors with the practiced efficiency of a person who had learned to assess people in the time it takes to cross a lobby. Her gaze moved from Brendan's jacket, dusty at the elbows where he'd been crouching near a renovation site earlier that afternoon, to his shoes, to his daughter's purple sneakers, and back to his face. The calculation happened in under 2 seconds. "Good evening." Her voice was pleasant in the way that cost nothing. "I understand there may be some confusion about your invitation." "No confusion," Brendan said. "My name is Brendan Hollis. I'm on the guest list." Portia took the invitation, studied it with great care, and then handed it back. "I'll need to verify this with our registration system. If you wouldn't mind waiting over here." She gestured toward a narrow bench near the exterior wall, away from the entrance and away from the glow of the lobby. It was the kind of spot that told you where you stood without anyone having to say it. Brendan looked at the bench. He looked at the stream of guests being waved through the entrance by a second staff member who wasn't checking anything. A couple in matching evening wear. A man with a diamond watch loose on his wrist. A woman who laughed at something on her phone while handing off her coat without breaking stride. "Of course," Brendan said. His daughter Cleo sat beside him on the bench, her legs too short to reach the ground, and she watched the entrance with the uncomplicated attention of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't paying attention. "Why does everyone else just walk in?" she asked. Brendan looked at the door. Good question. He had been asking himself a version of it for 14 months. Not about this entrance specifically, but about everything it represented. The complaints had started arriving quietly, tucked into the margins of donor emails and volunteer feedback forms. A retired teacher whose students had been seated in a back storage corridor during a gala and told to keep their voices down. A couple who had driven 2 hours for a public exhibition opening and been told, with great politeness, that the event was at capacity, though the couple standing behind them, in better coats, had been shown directly inside. A young artist who had submitted her work for the Emerging Talent Program and received no response for 3 months until Brendan found her application printed and sitting in a recycling bin in the director's office during a walkthrough. He had spoken to Vincent Oakes about each of these. Vincent had explanations for all of them: logistical errors, staff miscommunications, systemic adjustments during a period of growth. His reports were immaculate. Satisfaction scores up 14%, donor retention at an all-time high, press coverage exceeding previous years by a significant margin. The numbers were real. Brendan had checked them. What the numbers didn't explain was why the teachers kept canceling, why the community partnership applications had slowed to a trickle, why the people Lydia had specifically wanted to reach, the ones who had never been inside a gallery and weren't sure they were allowed to be, had stopped trying. Tonight was the annual Lydia Hollis Memorial Gala. Lydia had conceived it during her last year, when she understood she was running out of time and wanted to do something that would outlast her. The idea was simple: showcase emerging artists from underserved communities alongside established names, give them the same wall space, the same lighting, the same program notes. Charge the donors enough to fund it and let the artists' families in free. Brendan had arrived in his work clothes because he'd been at a construction site 3 hours earlier, reviewing progress on a community arts center his foundation was funding in Dorchester. He hadn't gone home to change. He'd brought Cleo straight from school, and she'd brought the paint on her sneakers from art class, and between the two of them they looked exactly like what they were: a father and daughter who had somewhere more important to be than a mirror. He had not announced the visit, that was the point. They had been on the bench for 18 minutes when a young woman appeared from a side corridor carrying a small tray, 2 glasses of sparkling water, a cluster of warm cheese pastries covered with a cloth napkin. She was maybe 23. with the slightly anxious look of someone trying to do the right thing in a place that had made that complicated. "I saw you waiting," she said quietly. She set the tray on the bench beside Cleo. "I'm Tess. I work the East Gallery floor. I'm sorry no one came sooner." Cleo reached for a pastry. She didn't get to touch it. Portia Thorne appeared from the entrance, took in the scene, and crossed the distance in 8 quick steps. She lifted the tray from the bench before Cleo's fingers closed around anything. "Tess." Her voice was level and entirely without warmth. "These guests haven't been cleared for hospitality service." Tess's color rose. "The child has been waiting almost 20 minutes. That is not your call to make. Return to your station." A few people near the entrance glanced over. Tess looked at Cleo, then at the empty space where the tray had been, then at Portia. She pressed her lips together and walked back inside. Brendan stood up slowly. Cleo was looking at the door Tess had gone through. Then she turned and looked at the wall opposite the entrance, where the evening light through the glass caught the edge of something large and luminous on the far side of the lobby. She had to stand on her toes to see it properly, but once she did, she went still. Dad. Lydia's painting covered most of the north interior wall. Brendan had placed it there 4 years ago after the opening, after a long conversation with himself about whether it was self-indulgent or simply honest. The painting was abstract, wide as a city block felt from the inside, built in layers of deep blue and oxidized gold, with a seam of pale silver along the lower third that Lydia had described, when she was well enough to describe things as the line between what you know and what you're still becoming. She'd painted it during her 3rd treatment cycle, when her hands had been unsteady enough that she'd switched to wider brushes and let the imprecision become part of the work. "That's Mom's painting," Cleo said, "not a question." "It is." "Does she know they put it here and won't let people like us see it?" The question did what questions from 9-year-olds often do. It cut through every adult layer of restraint and landed somewhere that was just true. Brendan didn't answer right away. He crouched until they were at the same level and took her hand. "She always said art belonged to everyone," he said. "That's why she wanted this place." Cleo looked through the glass at the painting. "Then why does this feel like it only belongs to some people?" Before Brendan could find the words, he heard a voice behind him, an older man, speaking to Portia at the entrance in the careful, precise tone of someone trying very hard not to inconvenience anyone. "I understand there may have been a scheduling change," the man was saying. "But we confirmed the reservation 2 weeks ago. I have the email here." Bernard Shea was perhaps 70, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a folded printout in his hand that he'd clearly been clutching since he arrived. Behind him stood 5 teenagers in what were obviously their best outfits. Button-downs that were a size off, blazers that belonged to older brothers, one girl in a dress that still had the crease from being folded in a shopping bag. They were trying to look like they belonged, the way teenagers always do, with a specific bravery of kids who'd been told something good was waiting for them. "The student section has been reallocated this year," Portia told Bernard. "We've accommodated an additional VIP table in that space." These students were promised access to the Emerging Artists Showcase. 3 of them are submitting work to the youth competition. That's why we came. "I understand that's disappointing. I can offer you general admission tickets for our next public opening in March." One of the teenagers, a boy in a blazer that was 2 inches too short at the wrist, looked at his phone. Brendan watched him start typing something. The kid was probably telling whoever was at home how it had gone. Bernard folded his printout carefully, the way people do when they're managing feelings that have nowhere else to go. "We drove 40 minutes, he said. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience." Brendan walked over and introduced himself. He asked Bernard if they could step aside for a moment. Bernard studied his face, then nodded. The art teacher had been bringing students to the Crestwood's Lydia Hollis Gala for 6 years. The first time he'd brought 2 kids from his AP Studio art class. Then 4. Then 7, then a full group, because the students went back to school and told their friends and word had spread through the program the way things do when something is genuinely good. His wife had died 3 years ago of the same kind of cancer that had taken Lydia. Bernard didn't know that, and Brendan didn't say it. But Bernard said that his wife had loved the Emerging Artist program because it reminded her that talent didn't care what neighborhood you grew up in. "Last year they put us in a corridor," Bernard said quietly. "I didn't say anything because the kids didn't seem to notice, but tonight," he stopped. He looked at the teenagers behind him, who were doing a careful job of pretending to look at something else. "Tonight I don't have an explanation for them." Brendan looked at the teenagers, then he looked back at the entrance. Wait here, he said. He went to Portia and told her he needed to speak with Vincent Oakes. Vincent emerged from the main hall 7 minutes later with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was the most important person in most rooms. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that had clearly been tailored in the past 6 months. He took in Brendan's field jacket the way Portia had, that same quick calculation, but hid it better. "Mr. Hollis," Brendan said, "there are some things I'd like to understand about tonight's event." "Of course." Vincent's smile was practiced and warm. "I understand there's been some confusion with your invitation. We can certainly find you." The students from Bernard Shay's program were guaranteed a section. They have written confirmation. Yes, we did have to make some adjustments to the floor layout. The demand from our major donor community has been exceptional this year, and the gala was created to give emerging artists from underserved communities a professional audience, Brendan said. That's why it exists. That's what it's funded to do. Vincent's expression remained pleasant. It was a very good expression. We've found that balancing community programming with donor expectation requires some flexibility. Our major contributors are the reason we can fund the program at all, so naturally their experience has to be protected, Brendan said. Prioritized, Vincent said. Cleo had drifted close enough to hear. She looked up at Vincent with the directness that children use before they learn it makes adults uncomfortable. Is he saying those kids can't come in because they're not rich enough? Vincent did not answer her. Brendan looked at him steadily. Who makes the final decisions about tonight? I do. Then I'd like you to reinstate the student section. I'm afraid that's not possible at this stage of the evening, but I'd be happy to offer complimentary tickets to our next. I don't want complimentary tickets. Brendan's voice had been quiet the entire conversation. That was when Vincent seemed to understand, for the first time, that quiet was not the same as uncertain. I want to speak with someone above your authority. Vincent's smile thinned at the edges. He glanced toward Portia and gave her a small nod, the kind of signal that meant bring security at a polite distance. Brendan looked through the glass at Lydia's painting. He thought about the morning she'd finished the last section of it. How she'd asked him to describe what he saw without knowing what she'd intended, and how his description had matched hers almost exactly. He thought about what she would say if she were standing in this lobby right now, watching her painting glow behind glass, while a teenager in a borrowed blazer stood outside trying to figure out what to tell his mother. He thought he knew exactly what she would say. He was about to speak when a sound came from inside the gallery. Not dramatic at first, just a catch, a gasp, the kind of thing that makes everyone in a room go quiet before they know why. Then a voice, "She can't breathe, someone help, she can't breathe." Brendan moved before Vincent could organize a response. Inside the main hall, near the east installation wall, a young woman had dropped to her knees beside her own artwork, a large geometric textile piece that hung from the ceiling, and was pressing one hand to her chest and the other flat against the floor. Her face was tight with the effort of pulling air in. Around her, a circle of guests had formed, holding their drinks and their phones and their uncertainty. "Has anyone called 911?" Brendan said. Silence. "Call now." He used the voice he used on construction sites when something was wrong and someone needed to not make it worse. Tess, who had followed from the lobby, reached for the nearest house phone. Brendan knelt beside the woman. She was trying to tell him something between shallow breaths. "Inhaler," she managed. "Can't find. It was in my bag." "Don't talk. Stay with me." He looked up at the staff gathering near the wall. "There's an emergency medical kit behind the east storage panel, second shelf, blue case. The panel's the one with the brushed metal latch, not the painted one." Portia had appeared in the doorway. "Guests aren't authorized in storage areas." Brendan looked at Tess. "Go." Tess went. Vincent stepped forward. "Let's keep this contained. We don't want—" "Stop talking," Brendan said, without heat, without drama. "Just stop talking." Tess returned in under 2 minutes with the blue case. It had a bronchodilator inside. Brendan checked the label, administered it, and kept his hand on the young woman's back while he talked her through, slowing her breathing down. He knew this building, the storage panel location, the emergency kit contents, the fastest route through the kitchen corridor to meet paramedics at the North Service entrance rather than the main elevator that cut out during event configuration. When the ambulance arrived, he directed them without hesitation. The young woman, her name was Dara, it was on her artist's badge, was stable by the time the paramedics loaded her. She gripped Brendan's arm before they moved her. "You knew exactly where everything was," she said. I designed the emergency access plan, he said. She looked at him for a moment, confused, and then they took her out. The main hall was quiet. Vincent stood near the entrance with a particular expression, the look of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had controlled. You know this building, he said. Brendan stood up and adjusted his jacket. I built it, he said. My name is on the deed, the founding documents, and the tax registration, and the painting on your north wall is by my late wife, who would not have recognized a single decision you've made in the past 14 months. Portia went still. Cleo had walked to the base of Lydia's painting. She stood under it the way she always did when she came here. Not like a tourist, but like it was hers, because it was. She turned and pointed up at it. My mom made that, she said to no one and everyone. Her name was Lydia Hollis. She paused. My dad built this whole place for her. The entrance door opened. Diane Pratt came in with 2 board members and a legal associate, carrying a brown folder and the composed expression of someone who had prepared for this. She'd been notified 2 hours ago that Brendan was conducting an unannounced operational review. Mr. Hollis, she said, the records you requested have been secured. 14 months of admission logs, donor communications, staff directives, complaint filings, and event planning documents. She handed him the folder. The room's temperature changed. Vincent said, I can explain the operational decisions we've. In a moment, Brendan said. He read for 2 minutes in silence while everyone waited. Then he looked up. The folder contained, among other things, a directive from Vincent to staff to deprioritize community program guests during events with major donors and seat them in auxiliary spaces without disclosing the change in advance. An informal memo to Portia establishing appearance-based admissions criteria that were never published, never included in staff training materials, never put anywhere they could be reviewed or challenged. A note approving the cancellation of Bernard Shea's student section 2 days ago, with no notification sent. A record of a formal internal complaint filed by a staff member 9 weeks ago about guests being turned away based on clothing and apparent income, followed 1 week later by a reduction in that staff member's scheduled hours. Tessa's name was on the complaint. The folder also contained Dara's artist registration form, submitted 6 weeks ago with a section clearly marked. Medical alert. Respiratory conditions, please ensure emergency inhaler access is noted with event medical staff. The form had been received. The notation had never reached the medical coordinator. Brendan closed the folder. He thought about all the polished reports, the 14% satisfaction increase, the record donor retention. He thought about how excellence could be manufactured from the outside while the inside went hollow, and how long you could maintain that illusion if the person responsible for checking had been grieving, and had learned to trust numbers because numbers were easier than going back to a place that still felt like loss. He accepted part of this. He had stayed away because coming back meant walking through rooms that still held her shape in the air. He had trusted the reports because standing in front of that painting without finding her, there was something he had not been ready to do. But his avoidance was not a license. It had never been a license. Lydia believed that beauty didn't belong to one class of person, he said. He wasn't addressing the room, exactly. He was saying it the way you say something when you need to hear it in your own voice to know it's real. She built this place on that belief. She spent her last year making sure it would exist after she couldn't. He looked at Vincent. You used her name on the invitation and then turned away the people she made this for. You altered the records, so the foundation couldn't see what you'd done. You silenced the staff member who tried to stop it. And tonight, because allergy information wasn't relayed to the right person, an artist almost stopped breathing in the room next to her own work. Vincent straightened his tie. I take full responsibility for lapses in communication. Your employment with the Hollis Cultural Foundation ends tonight. Brendan looked at Portia, as does yours. He turned to Diane. Coordinate with the board on suspension of the other supervisors named in those directives. No retaliation against any staff member who filed complaints or cooperated with the audit. Then he looked at Tess, who was standing near the east wall with her hands at her sides and an expression that had gone past frightened and come out somewhere quieter. Your position is reinstated, Brendan said. Full hours, back pay for every shift that was cut. I'd also like you to talk with Diane about the community liaison role we'll be creating. We need someone in this building who opens doors instead of calibrating them. Tess pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. Then she nodded. Brendan walked back to the entrance where Bernard Shea and his students were still standing in the corridor. Bernard had the folded printout in his hand, but as his arm had dropped to his side, and he was watching through the glass with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite resignation, something exhausted and careful in the space between. Brendan pushed the door open. "Come in," he said. He took them through himself. He walked slowly, pausing at each piece, explaining what he knew and asking what they saw. The teenagers lost their borrowed blazer stiffness within 15 minutes. One of them knew more about the color theory behind a particular installation than Brendan did, and he told her so, and she glowed with the specific brightness of a kid who has been taken seriously by an adult who meant it. Bernard stopped for a long time in front of Lydia's painting. "My wife's memorial service," he said finally. The program had an image of this piece on the cover. One of her former students found it. She said it looked like the way her teacher described hope, not the cheerful kind, the complicated kind. Brendan stood beside him and didn't say anything for a while. "She painted it when she was sick," he said. "She told me the shaky lines were more honest than the clean ones." Bernard nodded slowly. "My wife would have said the same thing." They stood there together while the gala rebuilt itself around them, smaller than planned, quieter than billed, but real in a way the manufactured version had stopped being. In the weeks that followed, Brendan restructured the foundation's oversight so that no single director could filter the complaints that reached the board. Staff were given a direct reporting channel. Admission practices were published, applied uniformly, and reviewed quarterly. The youth competition was expanded. Community programming was carved into the budget as a protected line, not a discretionary one. Emergency medical protocols were rewritten from scratch, with mandatory confirmation at every event. He named the main gallery hall the Lydia Room, not because he needed a monument, but because her name should be on the place she built, above the door this time, not just the invitation. The first Sunday of every month, the room opened free to school groups. Tess was there every time at the entrance, with the kind of welcome that didn't assess anything. A year later, Brendan and Cleo came back for the gala. The student section had its own wall now, small works hung beside the professional pieces, each labeled with a name, an age, and a school. Bernard's students had 3 pieces up. Cleo stopped in front of one near the end of the wall. A painting of an afternoon sky in blues and grays and that specific yellow-white that happens just before the light shifts. It was made by a 14-year-old from 3 towns over. "Dad," Cleo tilted her head, "this looks like the sky you described the day you met Mom." Brendan looked at it. She was right. He hadn't seen it until she said it, and then he couldn't unsee it. "It does," he said. They stood in front of it together while the room filled around them. Artists and teachers and families and donors and kids in borrowed blazers and kids in their own blazers and a retired teacher with a photograph in his coat pocket and a foundation officer reviewing admission logs on a tablet and a young woman named Tess who had once risked her job to bring sparkling water to a child waiting outside in the cold. The painting glowed in the gallery light, and Lydia would have recognized every single person standing under it.